Anton Chekhov, born 1860, died 1904, an extraordinarily influential and consequential innovator of both the play, the theatrical form, and the short story. A massively important figure, a major transitional figure as well between the traditions of realism and modernism. Those two things are basically creating a tension between them that gives birth to his art. He was born and raised in southern Russia. His father was a local merchant and church choir director, whom Anton described as abusive and tyrannical. Chekhov's family went bankrupt in his teens. He was left behind by his family when they moved to Moscow to avoid debtor's prison. Chekhov paid much of his way through school by odd jobs, tutoring, and writing short humor sketches for magazines. He rejoined his family in Moscow when he began medical school, largely supporting his entire family at that point, largely at this point by his writing. And during this time, in his mid-20s, he contracted tuberculosis, a condition he lived with until it killed him at the age of 44. Now, he practiced medicine throughout most of his life. Medicine, he said, is my lawful wife. But he added, and literature is my mistress. The writing was much more profitable than the medical practice, from which he pretty much never made any money. But the legacy of works that he leaves behind is really pretty extraordinary. He became, in a very short period of time, a leading figure of letters that attracting the attention and admiration of even figures like Tolstoy. Early major works include The Shooting Party, The Steppe, which is a novella, The Journey to Sakhalin, which is really a collection of letters and observations from a journey to the far east of Russia to a penal colony there. Remarkable reformist urge bubbling up in him in that. And some of the great plays, Uncle Vanya, The Cherry Orchard, Ivanov, Wood Demon, The Seagull, Three Sisters, all of these are iconic elements of the history of theater, and his tradition or his reputation is supreme in theater because of them. He also, very notably, wrote 574 short stories in his lifetime, or that he published. It doesn't say anything about what he might have scrapped, but you get the sense that he probably didn't throw out terribly much. A collection of his complete works was published in 1902, just a couple of years before his death, and he wasn't done writing yet, but that collection runs to 11 volumes. He was prolific. One of the more important figures in his life is Konstantin Stanislavski, the great Russian director and theoretician of acting, from whom we get the so-called method acting tradition. In 1896, fairly late in his career already, Chekhov's play The Seagull, the premiere did not go well. He was booed. He ran out of the theater midway through the performance, vowing to quit writing altogether. But the work attracted the attention of Stanislavski, who staged a new production just a couple of years later. That became a smash hit and gave birth to an entirely new aesthetic for theater in the new century. Stanislavski emphasized the psychology of the characters more than plot. Actors had to play the reality of the characters' mental stress instead of just moving them around the stage for the story to move forward. The subtext, the relationships among the characters, was more important than the text itself. The emphasis on psychological realism gave birth to what is known as method acting and greatly changed the potential of theater as an art form. Chekhov didn't always agree with Stanislavski's direction, often complaining that briskly paced comedy bits were suddenly moody eternities of silence between the actors' lines. But the work they did together coined the standard for how we look at acting today in all forms. Stage, TV, films, we judge a performance largely on whether or not we recognize the psychological reality in that person. Chekhov's work in theater heightened his growing fame and brought him further into contact with leading cultural figures of the day. Tolstoy, as we said, was an admirer of Chekhov's stories, and the two met relatively late in both their lives. Maxim Gorky was a friend who wrote that in Anton Chekhov's presence, everyone involuntarily felt in himself a desire to be simpler, more truthful, more oneself. It's pretty high praise. But pervading everything he wrote is a mood of impending change. His richest work comes right around the turn of the century, just a few years before the Bolshevik Revolution of 1917. Chekhov's characters all seem to be clinging to a past that's slipping away. We hear of economic pressures and class conflicts and political radicals who may have no power yet, but whose ideas sound logical enough to get some traction. Here, the political and the artistic threads join. The lack of resolution in Chekhov's plots imply a development that is impending, but not yet there. That's the state of Russia as it creeps toward revolution. That state of expectancy can be more than political, though. The world of realist art that Chekhov grew up in was becoming something new as the first buds of modernism were blooming. And even without politics or aesthetic, a feeling of being suspended between two worlds is the universal state of man, bound to the earth but imagining the ideal. Mere humanity is stuck, impotent, unheroic, and sad. But change is inevitable. So, in Chekhov, look for, number one, psychological realism. Every character needs to have an inner reality for his motivations, for his actions, for what is driving him. Also look for themes of bourgeois hypocrisy. Remember, he had some financial struggles throughout his life, and he would have been very familiar with comfortable people with some money in the bank, not understanding what all these poor people are fussing about. That theme gets developed in a number of different ways, but with a particular barbed angle in considerations of the bourgeois middle class. All of that is, of course, part and parcel of the themes of financial stress. So much a driver of realism from the start. The idea of we are animals in certain respects and we want dominance over one another. And this is a great thematic consideration throughout all of Chekhov's verse. But of course, you also have themes of stasis, the inability or unwillingness to change, even as the world seems to be changing around them. Chekhov's characters are always making that mistake. And then look also for the economy, the so-called Chekhov's gun in it. He is credited with this maxim of dramatic writing and plotting in general, where every element of a story has to be necessary and pay off in some way, in some significant way, and anything irrelevant needs to get scraped off. This is Chekhov's gun. If you show a gun in the first act, it has to come back in the third. That sense of value that imbues everything he writes. So when you're reading him, a lot of this stuff can seem just so, oh, he's just sort of blathering, yada, 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 yada. No, everything he is writing is very, very significant. And it might not be apparent at first, but even the very oddity, the seeming insignificance of it, pays off because it makes you remember it later on when you suddenly realize what that thing was. That's demanding an awful lot of patience on a reader's part, but that makes the reading itself much more fulfilling. Now, Chekhov's most visible legacy is probably the work he did with Stanislavski, which largely remade theater and acting styles in the 20th century. In America, two generations later, you find people like Tennessee Williams, Ilya Kazan, Lee Strasberg, and Marlon Brando putting a radical new emphasis on realistic portrayals of human psychology and a deep, sometimes agonizing interiority of humanity as a whole.